The bride thought she'd staged the perfect mockery, inviting her twin sister whom she thought was still poor only to flaunt her own glittering world of wealth and power. But gasps filled the hall as the twin descended from a roaring private jet, her entrance blazing like fire across the sky. At her side stood her billionaire husband, and in that breathtaking instant the tables turned. The one meant to be humiliated was now the queen of the moment. The private jet's engine screamed to life as Courtney Cross, formerly Martinez, gripped her husband's hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the small oval window, she could see Charlotte's wedding venue growing larger below them. The sprawling estate where she'd once been told she didn't belong. "Are you ready for this, my love?" Alexander's voice was steady, but Courtney could feel the tension in his fingers as they intertwined with hers. "I never thought I'd go back there," she whispered, watching the landing strip approach. "Not like this. Not as my wife. As someone who deserves every beautiful thing in this world." Alexander lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her wedding ring, a flawless 8-carat diamond that caught the morning light like captured starfire. The jet touched down with barely a whisper, the kind of landing that only happened when money was no object. Through the window, Courtney could see the wedding guests beginning to gather on the manicured lawns of the Thornfield estate, their designer gowns and tailored suits creating a sea of wealth and privilege. Somewhere in that crowd was Victoria, probably adjusting her veil one final time, completely unaware that her poor twin sister was about to step off a $50 million aircraft. "Mrs. Cross." The flight attendant appeared beside them with a warm smile. "We've touched down. Your car is waiting." Courtney's breath caught. Mrs. Cross. Even after 3 months of marriage, hearing her new name still felt like a dream she might wake up from. 6 months ago, she'd been scrubbing floors and counting pennies. Now she was married to one of the most powerful men in the country, and she still couldn't quite believe it was real. "The invitation said she wanted me there," Courtney said, more to herself than to Alexander. "But I know Victoria. I know what this really is." Alexander's jaw tightened as he helped her to her feet. "Then we'll show her exactly who you are now. And who you always were. She was just too blind to see it." The jet's door opened with a soft hiss, and Courtney stepped into the afternoon sunlight wearing a dress that cost more than she used to make in 6 months. The champagne-colored silk clung to her curves like liquid gold, and the sapphire necklace at her throat, Alexander's wedding gift to her, caught the light with every breath. But it wasn't the dress or the jewelry that transformed her. It was the way she held herself now, the quiet confidence that came from being truly, completely loved. "Oh my God," she heard someone whisper from the direction of the wedding party. Is that Courtney?" The whispers spread like wildfire through the assembled guests. Courtney Martinez, the poor twin, the family disappointment, the girl who'd disappeared into poverty and obscurity, was walking across the tarmac like she owned the world. Because in many ways she did. "Mrs. Cross." A man in an impeccable black suit approached them with military precision. "I'm James, your security detail." Mr. Cross arranged for discreet protection during today's event. Courtney glanced at her husband. "Security? You're worth protecting now, darling. You always were." Alexander's hand settled possessively on her lower back. "But now the whole world knows it." They walked toward the estate together, and Courtney could feel every eye tracking their movement. Phones were already coming out, guests frantically texting and snapping photos. By tonight, her transformation would be trending on social media. Through the crowd, she caught a glimpse of white silk and knew Charlotte had spotted her. Even from a distance, Courtney could see her sister's face go pale, her mouth falling open in shock. "She invited me to mock me," Courtney said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions in her chest. "She wanted me to show up in thrift store clothes, to be the cautionary tale at her perfect wedding. And instead," Alexander prompted, his voice rich with pride, "instead, I'm living proof that fairy tales are real." Courtney straightened her shoulders, the scared girl who'd received that invitation 6 months ago finally, completely gone. "Let's go remind my sister that she never knew me at all." But as they approached the crowd of wedding guests, Courtney's step faltered for just a moment. Because somewhere beneath the silk dress and diamond jewelry, beneath the confidence and the love that had transformed her life, the little girl who just wanted her sister to love her was still there. And that little girl was about to face the biggest test of her life. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as Alexander and Courtney approached, whispers following in their wake. Courtney could hear fragments of conversation. "Is that really the poor twin? Who is that man? That necklace has to be worth more than my house. Didn't she used to clean offices?" Charlotte appeared at the edge of the crowd, resplendent in white silk and French lace, her face a mask of shock and something that looked dangerously like fear. Her groom, Richard Blackwell III, stood behind her looking confused and slightly intimidated. "Courtney." Charlotte's voice came out as barely a whisper. You came. You invited me, sister." Courtney's voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd, warm honey over steel. "Though I suspect you weren't expecting me to accept." The two women stood facing each other for the first time in 3 years, mirror images transformed by completely different kinds of wealth. Charlotte's beauty was purchased and polished, every detail perfected by money and privilege. Courtney's was deeper now, the kind that came from being cherished, from knowing her worth. Of course I wanted you here," Charlotte stammered, but her eyes kept darting to Alexander, clearly trying to place him. "This is your friend." Alexander stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone within 50 feet. When he smiled, it was
predatory. "Allow me to introduce myself," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Alexander Cross, CEO of Cross Industries." The crowd's whispers turned to gasps. Even Charlotte's face went white. Everyone knew that name. "And Courtney's husband," Alexander continued, sliding his arm around Courtney's waist with obvious possession and pride. The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte's carefully planned wedding, her moment of perfect triumph, had just been completely upended by the sister she'd invited to humiliate. Act 2, the aftermath. The silence stretched like a taut wire across the manicured lawn, broken only by the soft whisper of champagne-colored silk as Courtney moved closer to her sister. Every guest seemed frozen in place, phones half-raised, conversations died mid-sentence, as if someone had pressed pause on the entire wedding. Charlotte's bouquet trembled in her hands, white roses and baby's breath that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her face cycled through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope, shock, disbelief, rage, and underneath it all, something that looked dangerously like panic. Husband. The word escaped Charlotte's lips like a prayer or a curse. Her emerald eyes darted between Courtney and Alexander, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke. "You're married?" Courtney's left hand caught the afternoon sunlight as she unconsciously touched her wedding ring, the 8-carat diamond throwing rainbows across the white tent. 3 months now. It was a beautiful ceremony. Small, intimate. Just the people who truly matter. The barb hit its target. Sirani had invited 400 guests to her wedding, turning what should have been a celebration of love into a performance of status. Courtney's wedding, by contrast, had been attended by 12 people who actually cared about her happiness. Margaret Thornfield appeared at Charlotte's elbow like a ghost materializing, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She stared at Courtney, as if seeing a stranger wearing her daughter's face. "Courtney, darling." Margaret's voice carried the brittle cheer of someone trying to maintain composure while their world tilted sideways. "You look different." "Love changes a person," Courtney replied simply, but there was steel beneath the silk in her voice. "For the better, when it's real." Alexander squeezed her hand gently, a gesture so subtle that only Courtney felt it. But that tiny touch grounded her, reminding her that she wasn't the scared girl who'd left this place 3 years ago. She was loved now, cherished, protected. Cross Industries, Richard Blackwell III finally found his voice, though it came out higher than usual. "You're the Alexander Cross? The one who bought out Meridian Tech last month?" "Among other things," Alexander replied with the casual confidence of someone whose net worth had more zeros than most people could count. His hand rested protectively on Courtney's lower back, a gesture that spoke of possession and pride. "Though I prefer to think of myself as Courtney's husband first, businessman second." The crowd was beginning to recover from their shock, conversations resuming in hushed whispers that carried on the afternoon breeze. "That's Alexander Cross. Forbes says he's worth $8 billion. She married a billionaire? The poor twin. Look at that necklace. Those sapphires are flawless. Didn't she used to work at that diner on 5th Street? Charlotte's grip on her bouquet tightened until her knuckles went white. This was supposed to be her day, her moment of triumph. She was marrying into the Blackwell fortune, securing her place in high society forever. She was supposed to be the sister who had it all. Instead, Courtney, poor forgotten Courtney, was standing there wearing a dress that probably cost more than Charlotte's entire trousseau, married to a man whose wealth made the Blackwell banking fortune look like pocket change. "I should go get ready," Sierra said suddenly, her voice bright and brittle as glass. "The ceremony starts in an hour, and I still need to." She gestured vaguely toward the estate house, her composure cracking at the edges. "Of course," Courtney said gently. For just a moment, her voice held the warmth it used to have when they were children, before money and jealousy had built walls between them. "It's your special day." Sarah looked at her sister for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the house, her bridesmaids trailing behind her like elegant ducklings. Margaret lingered for a moment, studying Courtney with the calculating gaze that had once made her feel like a disappointment. "We should talk later," she said finally. "There's so much to catch up on." "Is there?" Courtney asked quietly. "I seem to remember the last time we spoke, you told me I was no longer welcome in this family." Margaret's face flushed. "Courtney, I never said. You didn't have to." Courtney's voice was steady, but Alexander could feel the tension in her body. "Actions speak louder than words, Mother. They always have." After Margaret walked away, Alexander turned to face his wife fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "Are you all right?" Courtney leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his presence. "I knew it would be hard, but seeing her face, seeing all their faces." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. 3 years ago, I would have given anything for Sierra to look at me the way she just did. With respect. With fear. And now I realize I never needed her respect. I just needed to respect myself. Courtney's eyes met his, and Alexander saw the woman who'd captured his heart. Strong, resilient, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with the designer dress she wore. And to find someone who saw my worth when I couldn't see it myself. The crowd was beginning to disperse, guests moving toward the cocktail area while they waited for the ceremony to begin. But Alexander and Courtney remained where they were, in their own bubble of quiet intimacy amidst the chaos. "Tell me about the invitation," Alexander said softly. "About what really happened 6 months ago." Courtney's hand found his, their fingers intertwining automatically. "It arrived on the worst day of my life. I'd just been laid off from the cleaning service. I was 3 weeks behind on rent, and I'd been living on ramen noodles for so long I'd forgotten what real food tasted like." She paused, remembering that desperate girl who'd opened the cream-colored envelope with shaking hands. "The invitation was beautiful, expensive. Everything I couldn't afford. And there was a note from Victoria, asking me to be there for her special day. For one crazy moment, I thought maybe she actually wanted me there. That maybe she'd changed. But, Alexander prompted gently. But I knew better. Do anything without calculation. She invited me because she wanted to show off her perfect life, her perfect wedding, her perfect husband. She wanted me there to be the cautionary tale. The twin who didn't make it, standing in the corner in a thrift store dress while she sparkled in designer everything. Courtney's voice grew stronger, more certain. She wanted to win. To prove once and for all that she was the better twin, the one who deserved love and happiness and beautiful things. Instead, you married me, Alexander said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Instead, I found you. Courtney's eyes softened as she looked at him. This man who'd given her everything she'd never dared to dream of. Or you found me, depending on how you look at it. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower, casting everything in golden light. Soon you would walk down the aisle in her designer gown, marry her banking heir, and try to pretend that her sister's presence hadn't just turned her perfect day upside down. But first, there would be cocktails and whispered conversations, questions and stares, and the delicious shock of seeing the poor twin transformed into something magnificent. Courtney straightened her shoulders, the scared girl finally buried beneath layers of love and confidence. She was ready for whatever came next. After all, she'd already won the only prize that mattered. A love that saw her worth when the rest of the world was blind to it. "Shall we join the party, Mrs. Cross?" Alexander offered her his arm with old-world gallantry. "Let's," Courtney replied, her voice warm with anticipation. "I have a feeling this is going to be a very interesting wedding." As they walked toward the cocktail area, neither of them noticed Sarah watching from an upstairs window. Her wedding dress pooled around her like spilled cream, her face a mask of emotions too complicated to name. The real drama was just beginning. 6 months earlier, the fluorescent lights in Murphy's diner buzzed with the persistence of dying insects, casting everything in the harsh, unforgiving glow that made even the youngest faces look tired. Courtney Martinez, she'd legally dropped the Thornfield name on her 18th birthday, wiped down the same table for the 3rd time, her movements automatic after 6 years of working the morning shift. Her reflection in the coffee pot showed a face that could have graced magazine covers if circumstances had been different. High cheekbones, dark eyes that still held flecks of gold despite everything life had thrown at them, skin that glowed even under the unforgiving diner lights. But Courtney had learned long ago that beauty without money was just another burden to carry. "Order up." Danny's voice boomed from the kitchen, rough from 40 years of cigarettes and broken dreams. Courtney grabbed the plates. Eggs over easy, wheat toast, hash browns, and carried them to table 6, where Mr. Henderson sat reading yesterday's newspaper with the dedication of a monk studying scripture. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, same as every morning for the past 3 years. Mr. Henderson was 72, lived alone since his wife died, and came to Murphy's because the silence in his apartment was too loud. Courtney always gave him extra coffee and never charged him for the second slice of pie. "You're welcome, Mr. H." Her smile was genuine, one of the few real ones she allowed herself anymore. "How's the arthritis today?" "Oh, you know. Some days good, some days bad. But seeing your pretty face makes it better." Courtney's smile flickered. Pretty face. Everyone always mentioned her pretty face, as if it was supposed to be some kind of consolation prize for the hand life had dealt her. As if being beautiful was supposed to make the empty refrigerator, the overdue bills, and the bone-deep exhaustion somehow bearable. The bell above the door chimed, and Courtney looked up to see a familiar figure sliding into booth number 3. Sarah Chun, her old college roommate, now wearing a tailored blazer that probably cost more than Courtney made in a month. "Hey, stranger," Sarah called out, her voice carefully casual. "Got time for a quick catch-up?" Courtney's stomach clenched. Sarah only visited when she felt guilty about her success, which meant this conversation was going to hurt. But she walked over anyway, coffee pot in hand, because hope was a stubborn thing that refused to die even when it should. "Coffee?" Courtney asked, already reaching for a clean cup. Actually, I was hoping we could talk. Really talk. Sarah's eyes were kind but pitying, the look of someone who'd escaped a burning building and felt sorry for those still inside. I heard about the cleaning service laying people off. I'm sorry. Courtney's hand stilled on the coffee pot. She'd been hoping no one would find out about losing her second job. News travels fast. Small world. Listen, I know things have been tough since. Sarah's voice trailed off delicately. They both knew the story. Courtney dropping out of college junior year when the money ran out. The scholarship that had been her lifeline yanked away when her grades slipped after working 3 jobs to stay afloat. The slow, grinding descent into poverty while her classmates graduated and moved on to bright futures. Since I failed, Courtney finished quietly. You can say it, Sarah. I failed. That's not what I meant. But there was something in Sarah's voice that said it was exactly what she meant. I have a connection at my firm. Receptionist position. It's not much, but it's steady. Better than. She gestured around the diner with barely concealed distaste. Better than this. Better than serving coffee to lonely old men and cleaning up after people who wouldn't meet her eyes. Better than being the cautionary tale that successful people told themselves to feel grateful for their luck. What would I need to do? Courtney asked, hating herself for the hope that crept into her voice. Just be yourself. Well, maybe. Sarah hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Maybe tone down the whole tragic beautiful thing. It makes people uncomfortable. The words hit Courtney like a physical blow. Tone down the tragic beautiful thing. As if her poverty was a performance she was putting on for attention. As if she could simply choose to be different, better, more palatable to people who'd never had to choose between groceries and electricity. I see, Courtney said quietly. I'm trying to help, Sarah insisted, reaching across the table to touch Courtney's hand. I know you're proud, but sometimes we have to swallow our pride to survive. Pride. Courtney almost laughed. Pride was a luxury she'd given up long ago, somewhere between pawning her grandmother's jewelry and standing in line at the food bank. What Sarah mistook for pride was actually the last shreds of her dignity, carefully hoarded and protected because they were all she had left. Thank you for thinking of me, Courtney said, pulling her hand away. But I think I'll stick with what I know. Sarah's face fell. Courtney, I'm worried about you. This place. She looked around the diner again, taking in the cracked vinyl booths and the ancient coffee machine that wheezed like an asthmatic cat. This isn't a life. It's just existing. Maybe existing is enough, Courtney replied, but even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She wasn't living. She was surviving, day by day, paycheck to paycheck, keeping her head above water through sheer force of will. After Sarah left, with promises to stay in touch, that they both knew were empty, Courtney found herself staring at her reflection in the coffee pot again. The face that stared back was still beautiful, but there was something hollow around the eyes, something defeated in the set of her shoulders. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. Rent was due yesterday. Need payment by Friday, or we start eviction proceedings. Courtney closed her eyes and counted to 10, then 20, then 50. It didn't help. The panic was still there, clawing at her chest like a living thing. She'd grown up in a mansion with 12 bedrooms and a staff of 6. She'd learned to ride horses before she could properly walk, had taken piano lessons from a Juilliard graduate, spoke French with a Parisian accent. None of those skills were particularly useful when you were trying to figure out how to stretch a can of soup into 2 meals. The transformation hadn't been sudden. It had been slow, insidious, like drowning in reverse. First, the little luxuries disappeared. Designer clothes replaced with thrift store finds, restaurant meals becoming fast food, becoming grocery store bargains. Then the bigger things started going. The car repossessed, the apartment in the nice neighborhood traded for something smaller, cheaper, farther from the life she'd once known. Her mother had made it clear that help would not be coming. You made your choice, Courtney. You chose to leave this family when you changed your name. Actions have consequences. The choice. As if Courtney had chosen to watch her college fund evaporate when her father's business partner embezzled everything. As if she'd chosen to see her scholarship disappear when working 3 jobs to survive made maintaining a 3.5 GPA impossible. As if she'd chosen any of the circumstances that had led her here. He had made different choices. He had married the first rich man who showed interest, trading her freedom for financial security with the calculating precision of a stockbroker. He lived in a penthouse now, wore clothes that cost more than Courtney's yearly income, and pretended she didn't have a twin sister who served coffee for a living. "You okay, hon?" Danny's gruff voice cut through her spiral of self-pity. The old cook was looking at her with the kind of concerned kindness that made her throat tight. "Just tired," Courtney said, which was the truth but not the whole truth. She was tired in her bones, tired in her soul, tired of pretending that this half-life was enough. "Why don't you head home early?" Danny suggested. "Mel can cover the last hour." Courtney almost laughed. Home. Her studio apartment with the radiator that sounded like a dying elephant, and the neighbors who played music until 3 in the morning. The place where she'd received Charlotte's wedding invitation just 2 days ago, opening it with hands that shook from more than exhaustion. The invitation that had made it crystal clear exactly what Sarah thought of her. A deliberate cruelty wrapped in expensive paper and hand calligraphy. But as Courtney untied her apron and gathered her things, she made a decision that surprised even her. She was going to that wedding. Not because Charlotte wanted her there, but because she was tired of being invisible. Tired of being the sister who didn't count, the twin who'd failed, the cautionary tale whispered about at family gatherings she wasn't invited to. She didn't know how she'd afford a dress, or transportation, or any of the 100 things that separated her world from Charlotte's. But she was going to find a way. Because sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, the only thing left to do is show up and refuse to disappear. What Courtney couldn't have known was that in just 48 hours, everything would change. That a chance encounter in the rain would lead to a love story that would transform not just her circumstances, but her entire understanding of what she deserved from life. The scared girl wiping down tables in Murphy's diner had no idea that she was about to meet the man who would see past her circumstances to the woman she truly was. But first, she had to survive 2 more days of existing instead of living. And somehow, she had to find the courage to believe she was worth saving. 5 months earlier, the rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Cross's corner office on the 52nd floor, each drop exploding like tiny bullets against the glass. He stood with his back to the room, watching the city blur into impressionist streaks of light and shadow, while behind him his legal team dissected the remains of what should have been a simple business acquisition. "The Hendricks Group is claiming breach of contract," his lead attorney, Patricia Wells, was saying in the clipped tones of someone billing $800 an hour. "They're arguing that the merger terms changed substantially after the due diligence period." Alexander didn't turn around. At 32, he'd heard every variation of corporate legal drama that existed. Breach of contract, hostile takeovers, shareholder revolts. They all blended together into a symphony of greed disguised as business strategy. "They knew exactly what they were getting into," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made boardrooms fall silent. "Tom Hendricks has been cooking his books for 3 years. We have the forensic accounting to prove it." "Yes, sir, but nothing." Alexander finally turned, and the legal team collectively held their breath. When Alexander Cross looked at you with those ice-blue eyes, you felt x-rayed, examined, and usually found wanting. Tom Hendricks tried to defraud Cross Industries out of $40 million. Now he's crying foul because we caught him. End the merger talks. I don't do business with thieves. Patricia nodded, already calculating the billable hours this decision would generate. "Of course, sir. What about the Henderson contract? They're still waiting for your final approval on." "Approved. Anything else?" The team exchanged glances. Alexander's moods had been increasingly volatile lately, swinging between cold efficiency and barely controlled rage. No one wanted to be the person who pushed him over the edge. "That's everything for today, Mr. Cross," Patricia said carefully. "Good. Then get out." The words weren't shouted, but they carried the weight of absolute authority. The legal team filed out with the careful precision of people who knew better than to argue with their meal ticket. Alone again, Alexander returned to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. The city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board, millions of lights representing millions of lives he'd never touch, never know, never care about. His phone buzzed with a text from Vivian Ashworth, his girlfriend of 8 months. "Darling, the charity gala is tomorrow night. I need you to bid on lot 47, the Tuscany villa. We discussed this." Alexander stared at the message, feeling the familiar hollow ache that had become his constant companion. Vivian was beautiful, accomplished, connected to all the right families. She looked perfect on his arm at social events, knew how to navigate high society politics, and understood that their relationship was as much about image as emotion. She was also completely incapable of loving him for anything other than his net worth. He deleted the message without responding and called his assistant instead. "James, clear my schedule for the rest of the day. I'm going out." "Sir, you have the Meridian Tech conference call in an hour and the board meeting at. Reschedule everything." Alexander grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator, needing to escape the glass and steel prison he'd built around his life. 20 minutes later, he was walking through Central Park in the rain, letting the water soak through his $3,000 suit because it felt more real than anything he'd experienced in months. The park was nearly empty except for a few dedicated joggers and dog walkers. Alexander found himself on a bench near the pond, watching the rain create ripples across the dark water. For the first time in weeks, his phone was silent, his mind quiet. "Rough day?" The voice startled him. An elderly man had settled on the other end of the bench, wearing a shabby coat and holding a paper bag that smelled like fried chicken. "Something like that," Alexander replied carefully. He'd learned to be wary of strangers who approached him in public places. Too many people saw dollar signs when they looked at him. "I'm Frank," the man said, offering a piece of chicken from his bag. "You hungry?" Alexander almost laughed. When was the last time someone had offered to share food with him? "I'm fine, thank you." "Suit yourself. Though you look like a man who hasn't had a real meal in years." "I can afford real meals," Alexander said, defensive despite himself. Frank chuckled, a sound like gravel shifting. "Son, I've been homeless for 6 years. I know the difference between eating and nourishing yourself. You got that hollow look of someone who's starving even when his belly's full." The words hit harder than they should have. Alexander studied the old man, seeing genuine kindness in his weathered face, something he'd forgotten existed. "What happened?" Alexander found himself asking. "How did you end up here?" Frank finished. "Same way most folks do. One bad choice led to another, and before I knew it, I was living in my car. Then living under bridges. But you know what I learned out here?" Alexander waited. "Money don't mean nothing if you got nobody to spend it on. I lost everything, house, job, family. But I learned what really matters. Connection. Kindness. People who see you for who you are, not what you got." Frank was quiet for a moment, watching the rain. "You got people like that in your life?" Alexander thought about Vivian, about his board of directors, about the endless parade of people who surrounded him at galas and business dinners. People who laughed at his jokes because he signed their paychecks. People who called him brilliant when his investments paid off, and found excuses to be elsewhere when he needed actual support. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I do. That's the real poverty, son. Not having money is temporary. Not having love is what kills your soul." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two men from completely different worlds united by loneliness. Finally, Frank stood, gathering his meager possessions. "You take care of yourself," he said. "And remember, money can buy you a lot of things, but it can't buy you the only thing that really matters." After Frank left, Alexander remained on the bench as the rain continued to fall. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or market shares or hostile takeovers. He was thinking about connection, about what it would feel like to have someone in his life who saw him as something other than a walking bank account. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Vivian. Alexander, I know you're busy, but we really need to discuss the villa. My decorator says the renovation will take 6 months minimum. Alexander stared at the message, feeling something cold and final settle in his chest. Vivian's decorator. Her renovation plans. Her villa, purchased with his money, for her convenience. He typed back, we need to talk. 20 minutes later, he was sitting across from Vivian in her favorite restaurant, Le Bernardin, where a single meal cost more than most people made in a week. She looked immaculate as always, every blonde hair perfectly in place, her designer dress showcasing a figure maintained by personal trainers and private chefs. Darling, you look terrible, she said by way of greeting. Have you been walking in the rain? Your suit is ruined. Vivian, I think we should end this. The words came out cleaner than he'd expected. Vivian's fork paused halfway to her mouth, a piece of perfectly prepared fish balanced on the tines. And what? The Tuscany discussion? Because I really think the villa is a sound investment. Us. This relationship. Whatever this is. Vivian set down her fork with the careful precision of someone buying time to think. Alexander, I don't understand. Did something happen at work? Are you having some kind of breakdown? I'm having a moment of clarity, he said. I realized that in 8 months of dating, you've never once asked me how my day was. You've never asked about my childhood, my dreams, my fears. You know my net worth to the penny, but you couldn't tell a stranger my favorite color. That's not fair, Vivian protested, but her voice lacked conviction. We talk about lots of things. We talk about your things. Your parties, your friends, your decorating plans. When was the last time you said something to me that wasn't a request for money or a complaint about something you wanted me to buy you? Vivian's face flushed. I never asked you for anything you couldn't afford. That's not the point. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the woman he'd thought he might marry. Beautiful, sophisticated, completely empty where her heart should be. The point is that you've never asked me for anything that mattered. My time, my thoughts, my feelings. Just my money. You're being ridiculous, Vivian snapped. What do you want me to do? Pretend I don't know who you are? Pretend your success isn't attractive? I want you to see me as something other than a bank account with a pulse. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, and Alexander could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. How much she stood to lose, whether this was worth fighting for, if there was a way to salvage the relationship without actually changing anything fundamental about herself. I think you're having some kind of midlife crisis, she said finally. Maybe you should talk to someone. A therapist. Someone who can help you work through whatever this is. Alexander stood, pulling out his wallet and dropping enough cash on the table to cover their meal and a generous tip. Goodbye, Vivian. He walked out of the restaurant and into the rain, feeling lighter than he had in months. His phone was already buzzing with texts from Vivian, but he didn't look at them. Instead, he walked through the city, letting the rain wash away the last 8 months of pretense and compromise. That night, alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city, Alexander made a decision. He was going to find someone who could love him for who he was, not what he had. Someone real, authentic, unimpressed by his wealth and status. He had no idea that in just 2 days, he would quite literally run into that person outside a small cafe in the rain, both of them soaked and laughing and completely unaware that their collision would change everything. But first, he had to learn to believe that such a person could exist. That somewhere in a city of 8 million people, there was someone who would see past the money to the man underneath. Someone who would choose him not because of what he could give them, but because of who he was when everything else was stripped away. The lonely billionaire staring out at the city lights had no idea that love was just 48 hours away. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the city into a watercolor painting where everything blurred at the edges. Courtney pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down 5th Street, her sneakers squelching with every step. The umbrella she'd bought from a street vendor 2 blocks back had already given up the fight, its cheap ribs snapping in the wind like broken bird wings. She was late for her interview at the temp agency, Another dead-end possibility in a string of rejections. But the buses were running behind schedule, and her last $5 had gone to subway fare yesterday. Walking in a downpour was just another indignity in a life that seemed designed to test her breaking point. The coffee shop appeared like a mirage through the rain-blurred street, its golden windows promising warmth and temporary shelter. Café Luna, according to the hand-painted sign that swayed in the wind. Courtney had walked past it countless times, but never been inside. Their prices were firmly outside her budget. But today, soaked to the bone with 20 minutes before her interview, she decided that a single cup of coffee might be worth the splurge. Just this once. Just to remember what it felt like to sit somewhere warm and dry like a normal person. The bell above the door chimed as she pushed inside, and the scent of fresh ground coffee beans and cinnamon hit her like a warm embrace. The cafe was small and intimate, with mismatched furniture that somehow managed to look charming rather than shabby. Local artwork covered the walls, and jazz music played softly from hidden speakers. Courtney stood dripping in the doorway, acutely aware of how out of place she looked. Her jacket was more holes than fabric. Her jeans had been mended so many times they were more thread than original denim, and her hair hung in wet tangles around her face. Rough day. The voice came from behind the counter, a woman about Courtney's age with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. Her name tag read Maria, and she was looking at Courtney with the sort of genuine concern that had become rare in Courtney's world. Rough month, Courtney admitted, stepping fully inside and closing the door behind her. Sorry, I'm dripping all over your floor. Honey, it's just water. It'll dry. Maria grabbed a clean towel from behind the counter and handed it to Courtney. Coffee. Courtney pulled the crumpled $5 bill from her pocket. Her last $5 until her next shift at the diner. Just a small black coffee, please. Coming right up. Why don't you grab that table by the window? I'll bring it over. The table Maria indicated was tucked into an alcove that looked out onto the busy street. Courtney settled into the worn velvet chair, using the towel to dry her hair as best she could. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched people hurrying past under expensive umbrellas, their clothes and confident strides marking them as members of a world she'd once belonged to. Here you go, Maria said, setting down a large mug of coffee that smelled like heaven. And I threw in a blueberry muffin. On the house. Courtney looked up sharply. I can't accept. You can and you will, Maria said firmly. Everybody needs a little kindness sometimes, especially on days like this. The coffee was perfect, rich and smooth with hints of chocolate and caramel. The muffin was warm, clearly fresh from the oven, with berries that burst sweet and tart on her tongue. For a few precious minutes, Courtney allowed herself to simply exist in the moment. Warm, dry fed. It was enough. The bell chimed again, and Courtney glanced up to see a man stumbling through the door, as soaked as she had been but somehow making wet hair and a ruined suit look effortlessly elegant. He was tall, with dark hair that curled when wet, and the kind of bone structure that belonged in old Hollywood movies. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, blue as winter sky, but tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He stood in the doorway much as she had, looking around the cafe with an expression of mild bewilderment, as if he'd never been in such a place before. Another refugee from the storm, Maria called out cheerfully. Coffee. Please, the man said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of private schools and Ivy League universities. Whatever you recommend. Courtney watched as he chose a table across the cafe, noting the way he moved, careful, controlled, like someone unaccustomed to being in unfamiliar spaces. His suit was expensive, she could tell that even soaked through, and his watch caught the light with the subtle gleam of real gold. She should look away, mind her own business. But there was something about his expression, a loneliness that mirrored her own, that kept her attention fixed on him. Maria delivered his coffee with the same warm efficiency she'd shown Courtney, and the man thanked her with a politeness that seemed genuine rather than performed. He sat quietly, staring out at the rain, his hands wrapped around the mug as if seeking its warmth. Courtney's phone buzzed with a text from the temp agency. Due to weather conditions, All interviews have been rescheduled for tomorrow. Sorry for any inconvenience. She stared at the message, feeling the familiar sting of disappointment. Another day without potential income. Another 24 hours of uncertainty. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd survived worse disappointments than this. When she opened her eyes, the man across the cafe was looking at her with an expression of concern. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Courtney hesitated. Something about his voice, the genuine worry in his expression, made her want to answer honestly. "Postponed interview," she said. "Not the end of the world, just inconvenient timing." He nodded, as if he understood something about inconvenient timing. "Mind if I ask what kind of work?" "Anything that pays," Courtney said with a self-deprecating smile. "Administrative assistant, receptionist, data entry. Nothing glamorous, but it's honest work." "Honest work is undervalued," he said, and something in his tone suggested he spoke from experience. "I'm Alexander, by the way." Courtney. Beautiful name for a beautiful woman. The compliment was simple, delivered without the slick confidence she'd learned to distrust. It sounded like an observation, rather than a line. "Thank you," she said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Though I'm not sure drowned rat is my best look." Alexander smiled, and the transformation was remarkable. The tiredness in his eyes didn't disappear, but it was joined by something warmer, more alive. "I think you look exactly like someone who's brave enough to venture out in weather like this," he said. "That takes a certain kind of strength. Or a certain kind of desperation," Courtney replied honestly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." They fell into comfortable silence, both watching the rain paint patterns on the window. Courtney found herself stealing glances at Alexander, noting the way he held himself. Straight-backed but not rigid, confident but not arrogant. There was something almost old-fashioned about his manners, a courtesy that felt genuine rather than calculated. "Can I ask you something?" Alexander said suddenly. Courtney nodded. "What makes you happy? I mean really, truly happy?" The question was so unexpected that Courtney laughed. "That's quite a philosophical conversation starter. Humor me. I'm having an existential crisis." There was enough truth in his voice to make Courtney take the question seriously. She thought about it, really considered it, for the first time in years. "Small things," she said finally. "A really good cup of coffee. The way morning light looks through clean windows. Old movies where everyone talks fast and wears beautiful clothes. Books that make me forget where I am for a few hours." She paused. "What about you?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Courtney wondered if she'd overstepped somehow. But when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. "I used to think it was achievement. Success, recognition, building something that would last. But lately," he trailed off, shaking his head. "Lately I think it might be sitting in a small cafe on a rainy day, talking to someone who asks what makes me happy instead of how much money I made this quarter." Something in his tone made Courtney study his face more carefully. There was pain there, carefully hidden but unmistakable once you knew how to look for it. "Rough quarter?" she asked gently. "Rough decade," Alexander admitted. "I built exactly the life I thought I wanted, and it turns out it's not much of a life at all." Courtney understood that feeling better than he could know. Sometimes we have to lose everything to figure out what actually matters. And what actually matters? Connection, Courtney said without hesitation. Being seen by someone who chooses to see you. Having someone who makes your world bigger just by being in it. Alexander's eyes met hers across the small cafe, and something passed between them, recognition, understanding, the spark of possibility. "I'm glad I came in here today," he said quietly. "Even though you're soaked to the bone? Especially because I'm soaked to the bone. If I hadn't been desperate for shelter, I might have walked past. Might never have met you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to voice. Courtney felt something flutter in her chest. Hope, attraction, the dangerous beginning of feelings she couldn't afford. "Alexander," she said carefully, "I should probably mention that I'm not exactly in your social circle. I work at a diner. I live in a studio apartment with questionable plumbing, and this coffee represents a significant portion of my daily budget. Courtney, Alexander replied, his voice gentle but firm, I should probably mention that I don't care about any of that. What I care about is that you're the first person in months who's looked at me like I'm a human being instead of a balance sheet. The rain continued to fall outside, creating a cocoon of intimacy around their corner of the cafe. Neither of them moved to leave, content to let the conversation flow like the water streaming down the windows. They talked about books and movies, about dreams deferred and hopes rekindled. Alexander told her about his work, carefully avoiding specifics about the scope of his company. And Courtney shared stories from the diner, making him laugh with her impressions of regular customers. As the afternoon wore on, Courtney found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. Alexander asked questions that showed he was actually listening, offered insights that revealed both intelligence and empathy. Most importantly, he never made her feel ashamed of her circumstances or pitted for her struggles. I should probably go, Courtney said finally, glancing at her phone. I have a shift tonight, and I need to. Have dinner with me, Alexander said quickly, then caught himself. I'm sorry, that was presumptuous. I'm not ready for this conversation to end. Courtney's heart did something complicated in her chest. Alexander, I can't afford. My treat. Please. Just let me take you somewhere warm and dry where we can keep talking. The smart thing would be to say no. To thank him for the lovely afternoon and walk away before things got complicated. Before she started believing in fairy tales again. Instead, Courtney heard herself saying, okay, but somewhere casual. I'm not exactly dressed for fine dining. Alexander's smile could have powered the city grid. I know just the place. As they gathered their things and prepared to brave the rain again, Courtney caught sight of her reflection in the cafe window. Her hair was still damp, her clothes wrinkled and worn, but something in her face had changed. She looked alive again, awakened, like someone worth knowing. She had no idea that the man beside her was worth $8 billion, or that their impromptu dinner would be the beginning of a love story that would transform both their worlds. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow. And that was enough to start with. Do you want me to see how this relationship took you both through some challenging times? Share a moment when love helped heal your broken places. I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. 3 months earlier, the morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains of Alexander's penthouse, casting everything in the soft gold of a Renaissance painting. Courtney stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing one of his white dress shirts that fell to mid-thigh, watching the city wake up 47 floors below. The view still took her breath away, not because of the luxury, but because it represented how completely her world had transformed in just 1 month. Coffee. Alexander's voice was rough with sleep as he padded into the kitchen, wearing nothing but pajama pants that hung low on his hips. Even after weeks of waking up beside him, Courtney still felt her pulse quicken at the sight of him, rumpled and real, and utterly beautiful in the morning light. Please, she said, turning to watch him move through the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who'd finally found where he belonged. It had taken 3 weeks of gentle coaxing before Alexander had admitted he'd never actually made coffee in his own kitchen. His housekeeper had always handled such mundane tasks. Teaching him had become one of Courtney's favorite morning rituals. French press or espresso machine? He asked, holding up both options like a game show host revealing prizes. Surprise me, Courtney said, settling onto one of the bar stools that faced the kitchen island. She loved watching Alexander cook, or attempt to cook. For someone who commanded boardrooms with ruthless efficiency, he approached scrambled eggs with the concentration of a brain surgeon. So, Alexander said as he measured coffee grounds with scientific precision, I have a confession to make. Courtney's heart skipped. After a lifetime of disappointments, her first instinct was always to brace for bad news. Oh, I may have cleared my entire schedule today. He glanced up at her, blue eyes sparkling with mischief. I told my assistant I was having a mental health day and not to disturb me unless the building was literally on fire. Alexander crossplayed hooky? Courtney gasped in mock horror. What will the shareholders think? The shareholders can survive 24 hours without me micromanaging their investments. Alexander poured hot water over the coffee grounds, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. Besides, I have more important things to do today. Such as teaching my girlfriend how to be properly spoiled. The word girlfriend still sent a thrill through Courtney. After years of being invisible, unwanted, discarded, the idea that someone like Alexander could claim her with such pride felt like a miracle she was still learning to believe. I already told you, I don't need expensive things, Courtney said softly. It was an argument they'd had several times. Alexander's desire to shower her with gifts running headlong into Courtney's discomfort with accepting them. I know you don't need them, Alexander said, moving around the island to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. But I want to give them to you anyway. Not because I think they'll change how you feel about me, but because you deserve beautiful things. You always have. His hands were warm through the thin cotton of his shirt, and Courtney leaned back against his chest, letting herself sink into his strength. This was still new for her, allowing someone to support her, literally and figuratively. Years of independence born from necessity had made trusting difficult. What did you have in mind? She asked. Well, Alexander said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I thought we could start with breakfast at that little place you love in Soho. Then maybe some shopping. And before you protest, I'm talking about buying you clothes that actually fit properly, not designer gowns. Although, he added thoughtfully, a designer gown or two wouldn't go amiss. Alexander. Then, he continued, spinning her stool around so she was facing him, I thought we could go to the Met. You mentioned you haven't been to a museum in years, and there's a new exhibition on Renaissance art that I think you'd love. Courtney's protest died in her throat. It wasn't the money he wanted to spend, though that still made her uncomfortable. It was the thoughtfulness. The way he'd listened when she'd mentioned things she missed, things she'd given up when survival became more important than living. You really cleared your whole day? She asked. I cleared my whole day, Alexander confirmed. The most powerful man in New York is entirely at your disposal, Miss Martinez. What would you like to do with him? Courtney stood up, closing the distance between them until they were breathing the same air. Alexander's hands came up automatically to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the high curve of her cheekbones. I want to do exactly what you suggested, she said. But first, I want to tell you something. Anything. A month ago, I was so broke I was counting the sugar packets at the diner to make sure I didn't take too many home. I was living on ramen noodles and hope, working 3 jobs just to stay one step ahead of eviction. Courtney's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the vulnerability in her eyes. And now I'm standing in a penthouse wearing a shirt that probably costs more than I used to make in a month, planning a day of leisure like it's the most natural thing in the world. And, Alexander prompted gently, and I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to wake up and realize that I'm not worth all this, that I'm just a broke waitress who got lucky. Alexander's hands tightened on her face, his expression fierce with emotion. Courtney Marie Martinez, you listen to me very carefully. You are not lucky. I am. You didn't trick me or seduce me or manipulate me into caring about you. You simply existed, beautifully and authentically, and I was smart enough to recognize something extraordinary when I found it. He leaned down until their foreheads touched, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. The money, the penthouse, the clothes, those are just things. Nice things, comfortable things, but just things. What I feel when I look at you, when I hear you laugh, when you fall asleep in my arms, that's not something money can buy. Courtney felt tears prick at her eyes. I'm not used to being someone's priority. Get used to it, Alexander said firmly. Because you're mine now, and I take very good care of what's mine. The possessiveness in his voice should have scared her. Instead, it made her feel safe in a way she'd never experienced before. Cherished, protected, claimed by someone who saw her value when the rest of the world had written her off. Okay, she said softly. Okay, spoil me. Just for today. But I have one condition. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Name it. Tonight, You let me cook dinner for you. In this ridiculous kitchen with its restaurant-grade appliances that probably cost more than a car. I want to make you something with my own hands. Alexander's smile was brilliant. Deal. Though I should warn you, I may never let you leave after that. Good, Courtney said, rising up on her toes to kiss him softly. I wasn't planning on going anywhere. 2 hours later, they were walking hand in hand down Spring Street, Courtney wearing a new sundress that fit her like it had been made for her body. Alexander had been ruthless in the boutique, dismissing anything that was merely expensive in favor of pieces that made Courtney's natural beauty shine. You realize you just spent more on clothes in 1 hour than most people spend in a year, Courtney said as they settled into a corner table at her favorite cafe, the same one where they'd met. Worth every penny, Alexander said, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. The dress was simple, navy blue with tiny white flowers, but it transformed her. Or maybe it was happiness that had transformed her. Either way, Alexander couldn't stop staring. Maria's going to faint when she sees you, Courtney said, waving at the woman behind the counter who had played unwitting matchmaker to their love story. Why? Because last time I was here, I could barely afford a single cup of coffee. Now I'm back with a man who just bought me a wardrobe that would make a Hollywood starlet weep with envy. Alexander reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Do you regret it? Any of this? Courtney considered the question seriously. A month ago, her life had been small, contained, manageable in its limitations. Now it felt vast and uncertain, and full of possibilities that both thrilled and terrified her. No, she said finally. I don't regret it. But sometimes I feel like I'm playing dress-up in someone else's life. This is your life now, Alexander said gently. Our life. And you belong in it just as much as I do. At the Met, Alexander watched Courtney move through the galleries with the focused attention of someone starved for beauty. She stopped in front of each painting, reading every placard, asking questions that revealed both intelligence and genuine curiosity. Tell me about this one, Alexander said, stopping beside her in front of a Botticelli that had captured her attention for the past 5 minutes. It's The Birth of Venus, Courtney said softly. But look at her face. Everyone focuses on the nudity, the sensuality, but look at her expression. She's not seductive or knowing. She looks almost uncertain, like she's not sure she deserves to be beautiful. Alexander studied the painting, then looked at Courtney. Maybe that's what makes her beautiful. The vulnerability. Or maybe, Courtney said, someone finally convinced her she was worthy of love. They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by centuries of human creativity and longing. Alexander found himself thinking about the life he'd built. Successful, profitable, empty, and comparing it to this moment. Standing in a museum with a woman who saw beauty in everything, who made him want to be better than he'd ever imagined possible. Courtney, he said quietly. I think I'm falling in love with you. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like wonder. Think, she asked. No, Alexander corrected. I know I'm falling in love with you. Have been since that first day in the cafe, when you looked at me like I was just a person instead of a walking bank statement. Courtney's smile was radiant. Good, she said. Because I've been completely gone on you since you asked what made me happy instead of what I could do for you. They kissed there in the museum, surrounded by masterpieces, but creating something more beautiful than anything hanging on the walls. A love built on recognition, understanding, and the revolutionary idea that they deserved each other. That evening, Courtney cooked dinner in Alexander's kitchen, filling the sterile space with the warm smells of garlic and herbs and home. Alexander sat at the island, watching her move with unconscious grace, marveling at how completely she'd transformed not just his apartment, but his entire understanding of what life could be. My mother called today, Alexander said as Courtney plated their meal. Courtney's hands stilled for a moment. Alexander rarely talked about his family, and when he did, it was with the careful neutrality of someone discussing business associates rather than loved ones. Oh, she wants to have dinner. Meet the woman who's been monopolizing my time, as she put it. Courtney set the plates down and took her seat across from him. And what did you tell her? I told her I'd ask you. But Courtney, you should know, my mother can be difficult. She has very specific ideas about the kind of woman she wants me to end up with. Rich, connected, socially appropriate, Courtney said matter-of-factly. Exactly. Alexander reached for her hand. Which is ridiculous, because what I want is someone real. Someone who makes me laugh, who challenges me, who sees the man instead of the money. Someone exactly like you. Courtney squeezed his fingers. I can handle your mother, Alexander. I've been handling difficult people my entire life. I know you can. I just want you to know that whatever she says, whatever attitude she gives you, it doesn't matter to me. You matter to me. I love you too, Courtney said softly. It was the first time either of them had said the words without qualification or hesitation. They hung in the air between them, perfect and true, and absolutely terrifying in their implications. Because love like this, real, transformative, life-altering love, was worth fighting for. And very soon, they were going to have to fight for it. 2 weeks before the wedding. The photograph splashed across the front page of the New York Social Register was devastating in its clarity. Alexander Cross, billionaire CEO, caught in an intimate embrace with an unknown woman outside Café Luna. The headline screamed, Cross's mystery woman, from rags to riches romance or gold digger's jackpot? Courtney stared at the newspaper in the lobby of Alexander's building, her hands trembling as she read the brutal assessment of her character. The article had done its homework, interviews with former employers, speculation about her motives, even a quote from Sarah that made Courtney's blood turn to ice. My sister has always been ambitious. She struggled financially for years, so I suppose it makes sense that she would seek out someone who could solve her problems. I just hope Mr. Cross knows what he's getting into. Miss Martinez? The doorman's voice was carefully neutral, but Courtney could see the judgment in his eyes. Yesterday, he'd greeted her with warm respect. Today, she was the gold digger who'd made headlines. Is Mr. Cross in? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll check. He picked up the phone, and Courtney caught fragments of the conversation. The woman from the papers. Yes, sir. I understand. When he hung up, his expression had shifted to something approaching pity. Mr. Cross is in meetings all day. He asked me to tell you he'll call you later. The dismissal hit Courtney like a physical blow. Alexander had never been in meetings when she wanted to see him. His assistant had strict instructions to interrupt anything short of a board meeting if Courtney called. But that was before her face had been plastered across the society pages like a scarlet letter. Courtney left the building with as much dignity as she could muster, but inside she was crumbling. The story had been picked up by gossip blogs, social media accounts, even a segment on the morning news. By noon, she was trending on Twitter with hashtags that made her want to disappear forever. Hashtag gold digger, hashtag rags to riches, hashtag crossed in love. Her phone buzzed constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, tabloids offering money for her story, strangers sending messages that ranged from supportive to vicious. She turned it off and walked blindly through Central Park, ending up on the same bench where Alexander had once sat with Frank, the homeless man who'd taught him about real wealth. Rough day, sweetheart. Courtney looked up to find Frank himself settling beside her, his weathered face kind but concerned. She'd met him several times when walking with Alexander, and he'd always greeted her with the sort of genuine warmth that money couldn't buy. Frank, she said, trying to smile, I didn't expect to see you here. This is my office, he said with a grin, gesturing to the park around them. And you look like someone who could use a friendly ear. Courtney pulled out the crumpled newspaper, handing it to him without comment. Frank studied the headline, then looked at her with something approaching disgust. Vultures, he said simply. They can't stand to see something beautiful without trying to tear it down. Maybe they're right, Courtney said quietly. Maybe I am just a gold digger who got lucky. Frank's laugh was sharp. Girl, I've been watching that boy for months now. Seen him before he met you and after. You know what the difference is? Courtney shook her head. Before, he was rich and miserable. Now he's rich and alive. That's not gold digging, sweetheart. That's love. Then why won't he see me? The words came out broken, raw with pain. His doorman said he was in meetings, but Alexander doesn't hide from problems. He faces them. Frank was quiet for a moment, studying her face. Maybe he's not hiding from the problem. Maybe he's trying to solve it. But even as Frank's words offered comfort, Courtney couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The fairy tale was over, and reality was reasserting itself with brutal efficiency. Meanwhile, 47 floors above the city, Alexander Cross stood in his office surrounded by his legal team, his publicist, and enough damage control strategies to fill a textbook. The phones hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke, and every call brought worse news. The Meridian deal is stalling, his lead counsel reported grimly. The Patterson Group is citing concerns about leadership stability as grounds for renegotiation. 2 board members have requested an emergency meeting, added his publicist, a sharp-faced woman named Christine who specialized in crisis management. They're worried about how this reflects on the company's image. And there's this, his assistant James said reluctantly, handing over a tablet loaded with social media feeds. The comments were vicious, cruel assessments of Courtney's character, mixed with speculation about their relationship that made Alexander's jaw clench. "Sir," Christine's voice cut through his rage. "We need to discuss strategy. The longer this story dominates the news cycle, the more damage it does to both your personal and professional reputation. What are you suggesting? Distance. Publicly and immediately. A statement expressing disappointment at being deceived. Gratitude for discovering the truth before making any permanent commitments. We position you as the victim who was taken advantage of by a calculating woman." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. "Absolutely not. Sir, with respect, your personal feelings aside, you have fiduciary responsibilities to your shareholders. This scandal could cost the company millions if it continues." Alexander turned to stare out at the city below, his hands clenched into fists. Somewhere down there, Courtney was dealing with this nightmare alone while he hid in his tower, surrounded by advisors who saw her as nothing more than a problem to be managed. "There's something else," James said quietly. "Miss Martinez has been trying to reach you. She came by this morning, and she's called 6 times. You told the doorman to say I was unavailable," Alexander said, his voice flat. "You said you needed time to think. I said I needed time to figure out how to protect her." Alexander exploded, spinning around to face the room. Not time to decide whether she was worth protecting. The silence that followed was deafening. Christine cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Cross, I understand your emotional attachment to Miss Martinez, but surely you can see how this situation appears to outside observers. A woman with significant financial difficulties, suddenly involved with one of the wealthiest men in the country." "Stop." Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. "Everyone out. Now. Sir, we really need to. Out." The room cleared with impressive speed, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts, and the horrible realization that he'd already failed the most important test of his life. While Courtney was facing public humiliation and character assassination, he'd been hiding behind lawyers and publicists, trying to figure out how to save his reputation instead of protecting the woman he loved. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Alexander, darling, I hope you're being sensible about this unfortunate situation. These sorts of women are very cunning, but surely you can see now what she really is." Alexander stared at the message, feeling something cold and final settle in his chest. His mother, who'd raised him to believe that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. His board, who saw Courtney as a liability to be managed. His advisors, who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. All of them were wrong. But by the time he'd reached that conclusion, it might have been too late. Courtney had gone home to her studio apartment, the lease she'd kept even after moving in with Alexander, partly for practical reasons, but mostly because old habits of self-preservation died hard. The space felt impossibly small after months in his penthouse, cramped and shabby and real in a way that made her question everything that had happened since that rainy day in the cafe. Her phone, when she finally turned it back on, had 37 missed calls and over 200 text messages. Most were from reporters or strangers, but 3 were from Alexander. She listened to his voicemails with her heart hammering. "Courtney, I'm sorry about this morning. There's a lot happening right now, and I'm trying to figure out the best way to handle it. Can we talk tonight? Bella, please call me back. I know how this looks, but I need you to trust me. I love you, and we're going to get through this. I'm coming over. We need to talk." The third message had been left an hour ago. Courtney looked around her apartment, really looked at it, seeing it through the eyes of a man who lived in a penthouse, who was used to space and luxury and beauty. The couch with its worn cushions, the kitchenette with barely enough room for one person, the window that looked out onto a brick wall instead of the city skyline. This was who she really was. Not the woman in designer dresses and sapphire necklaces, but the girl who counted sugar packets and mended clothes until they were more thread than fabric. When Alexander's knock came, Courtney almost didn't answer. But love, even wounded love, was stronger than pride. He stood in her doorway looking like he'd aged years in a single day, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie loosened, exhaustion written in every line of his body. "Courtney," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. "Hi," she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. Alexander looked around the tiny apartment, and Courtney braced herself for the moment when reality would crash into their fairy tale. When he would see her as she really was, poor, ordinary, completely out of his league. Instead, he sank onto her second-hand couch and buried his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice muffled. "I'm so goddamn sorry. I should have been with you today. Should have protected you from this. Alexander, they want me to throw you away," he said, looking up at her with eyes that held too much pain. "My board, my publicist, my own mother. They want me to issue a statement saying I was deceived, that you're exactly what the papers are claiming you are." Courtney felt the last piece of her heart break. "Maybe you should." "What?" "Maybe you should listen to them." Courtney sat down across from him, careful to maintain distance between them. "Look around, Alexander. This is my real life. That apartment you've been living in, the clothes, the restaurants, that's not me. That's you trying to turn me into someone I'm not. That's not true, isn't it?" Courtney's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the tears threatening. "I'm a waitress from the wrong side of town who got swept up in a fairy tale. But fairy tales end, and when they do, people like me get hurt while people like you go back to their real lives." Alexander stood up abruptly, crossing to where she sat. "Don't you dare," he said fiercely. "Don't you dare use their poison to tear us apart. I'm not tearing us apart. I'm facing reality. Our reality is that I love you and you love me. Everything else is just noise. Noise that's destroying your company. Noise that's making you choose between me and everything you've built." Alexander knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Then I choose you. Every time, without hesitation, I choose you. But what if I can't let you?" Courtney whispered. "What if I love you too much to let you sacrifice everything for me?" The question hung between them like a blade, sharp and final, and absolutely devastating. Because for the first time since they'd met, both of them could see the impossible choice that love had placed before them. His world or hers, his life or her conscience, their happiness or everyone else's expectations. And neither of them knew if love alone would be enough to bridge a gap that suddenly seemed infinite. 1 week before the wedding, Courtney stood in the pre-dawn darkness of her apartment, holding the plane ticket Alexander had sent via messenger. First class to London, one way, with a note written in his careful handwriting. "If you can't stay and fight for us, at least let me give you a new beginning somewhere the tabloids can't follow. I love you enough to let you go. A." She'd been staring at the ticket for 3 hours, ever since the messenger had woken her at 4 a.m. with the expensive envelope. Outside, the city was beginning to stir, delivery trucks rumbling past, the first subway trains carrying early commuters to jobs that started before the sun rose. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that Courtney Martinez was holding her entire future in her trembling hands. The past week had been a special kind of hell. The story had grown legs, spreading from gossip columns to legitimate news outlets. Her photo was everywhere, unflattering shots of her in her diner uniform, alongside carefully chosen pictures of Alexander at charity galas with beautiful socialites. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Worse were the interview requests that had escalated to harassment. Reporters camping outside Murphy's diner until Danny had to call the police. Photographers following her to the laundromat, to the grocery store, to the library where she'd been hiding out trying to think. But the worst part was the silence from Alexander. Oh, she understood why. Every day they were apart was another day for the story to die down, another opportunity for his legal team to craft the perfect response. She'd seen the statements his publicist had released. Carefully worded non-commitments that neither confirmed nor denied their relationship, designed to protect his reputation while the lawyers figured out how to make the problem disappear. The problem. That's what she'd become. Courtney set the plane ticket on her small kitchen table and made coffee with hands that had finally stopped shaking. The routine was soothing, measure, pour, wait. Simple actions that required no decisions, more complicated than how much sugar to add. She was reaching for her favorite mug when her phone rang. Not the cell phone that had been buzzing non-stop with reporters and strangers, but the old landline that only 3 people in the world had the number for. Courtney. Charlotte's voice was crisp, professional, completely devoid of warmth. We need to talk. Courtney's sister had been strategically absent since the story broke, letting their mother handle the family response, while Cyril maintained plausible deniability. After all, she had a wedding to think about, a reputation to protect. Hello, Victoria. I'm downstairs. Buzz me up. Courtney looked around her tiny apartment, seeing it through Charlotte's eyes. The carefully maintained but obviously second-hand furniture, the cracks in the walls that no amount of cleaning could hide, the single window that faced a brick wall instead of a view. I'll come down, Courtney said. Cyril stood beside a black town car that probably cost more than Courtney's annual rent, looking like she'd stepped off the pages of Vogue. Her hair was perfect despite the early hour, her makeup flawless, her designer coat probably chosen specifically to contrast with the shabby neighborhood. Get in, Cyril said without preamble. The car's interior was all leather and polished wood, a mobile sanctuary from the real world. Cyril settled into the seat across from Courtney with the fluid grace of someone who'd never had to think about whether she belonged in expensive spaces. You look terrible, Cyril said by way of greeting. Courtney studied her sister's face, looking for some hint of warmth, of concern, of the girl who'd once shared her secrets and dreams. She found nothing but cold calculation. It's been a difficult week, Courtney replied carefully. I imagine it has. Sierra pulled out her phone, scrolling through what looked like news alerts. Though I have to say, I'm impressed by your thoroughness. When you set out to reinvent yourself, you certainly didn't do it halfway. What's that supposed to mean? Oh please. Charlotte's laugh was like cut glass. The mysterious meeting in a cafe, the whirlwind romance, the dramatic transformation from rags to riches. It's like something out of a romance novel. Quite the performance. Courtney felt something cold settle in her stomach. You think I planned this? I think you're smarter than anyone ever gave you credit for, including me. So he leaned forward, her green eyes sharp with something that might have been admiration if it weren't so calculating. Alexander Cross. Of all the rich men in New York, you managed to hook the biggest fish in the pond. I didn't hook anyone, Courtney said quietly. I fell in love. Love. Sir Otitia pronounced the word like it tasted bitter. How wonderfully romantic. Though I notice your love story is causing quite a few problems for your Prince Charming. I'm aware of that. His stock price has dropped 12% since the story broke. 3 major deals are on hold. His board is reportedly furious. Charlotte's voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering precisely calibrated pain. All because he couldn't resist playing pretty woman with his little charity case. Stop. The truth hurts, doesn't it? You're destroying him, Courtney. Everything he's worked for, everything he's built. It's all crumbling because he was foolish enough to fall for your act. Courtney wanted to argue, to defend what she and Alexander had built together. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. Every day they remained together was another day of damage to his reputation, his business, his future. "What do you want, Victoria?" "I want you to disappear." Charlotte's voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. "Cleanly, quietly, permanently. Take whatever settlement his lawyers offer you and vanish. Change your name, move to another country, start over somewhere else. And if I don't, then you'll destroy the only man who's ever been stupid enough to love you." Charlotte's smile was sharp as a blade. "And eventually, he'll realize what everyone else already knows, that you're not worth the price he's paying." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Courtney had been thinking the same thing for days, wrestling with the horrible possibility that love might not be enough to overcome the gulf between their worlds. "You know," Sarah continued conversationally, "I used to be jealous of you. All those years growing up, watching people fawn over how beautiful you were, how naturally everything came to you. I had to work for attention, but you just existed, and everyone adored you. That's not how I remember it." "No, I suppose you wouldn't. You were too busy being tragic and beautiful to notice that some of us had to actually try." Charlotte's voice carried years of buried resentment. "But I learned something you never did. Beauty fades, tragedy gets old, but money lasts forever." "Is that what this is about? Money?" "This is about reality," Sarah snapped. "I'm marrying Richard because he's stable, reliable, and wealthy enough to give me the life I want. No grand passion, no fairy tale romance, just a solid foundation for the future. While you," she gestured dismissively, "you've been chasing fantasies and calling it love." "What Alexander and I have is real," Courtney said firmly. "What you have is unsustainable." Sarah pulled a thick envelope from her purse. "This is a cashier's check for $5 million. Alexander's lawyers sent it to our family attorney this morning, along with a confidentiality agreement." Courtney stared at the envelope like it was a snake. "He wouldn't." "He did. Because he's finally come to his senses and realized that some problems can only be solved with money." Sarah held out the envelope. "Take it, Courtney. It's more than you could earn in 10 lifetimes, and it solves everyone's problems. Everyone except Alexander. Alexander will be fine. Rich men always are. He'll find someone appropriate, someone who enhances his world instead of complicating it. Someone like Vivian Ashworth. I heard she's been very sympathetic about his unfortunate entanglement." Vivian, Alexander's ex-girlfriend, the one he'd broken up with because she only saw his bank account. The perfect society wife who would never embarrass him in the press or complicate his business dealings. Courtney took the envelope with numb fingers, feeling the weight of it. The weight of $5 million, of freedom, of the easy way out that would save Alexander's reputation and her own conscience. "Smart girl," she said approvingly. "I'll expect confirmation that you've left the city by tomorrow evening. The confidentiality agreement means you can never speak about the relationship publicly, which protects all of us." After Sarah left, Courtney sat alone in the back of the town car as it drove her home. The envelope felt like it was burning through her purse. 5 million reasons to walk away from the only man who'd ever truly seen her. She thought about the plane ticket waiting on her kitchen table, about starting over in London where no one knew her story, about Alexander, probably sitting in some boardroom right now while lawyers and publicists plotted damage control strategies, about the look in his eyes when he'd said he loved her enough to let her go. But as the car pulled up to her building, Courtney made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of going upstairs to pack, she gave the driver Alexander's address. It was time to stop letting other people make choices about her life. Meanwhile, Alexander sat in his office staring at a different envelope. Resignation letters from 3 board members, an ultimatum from his biggest investor, and a formal request from the Patterson Group to reconsider the leadership structure of any potential merger. The cost of loving Courtney was becoming clearer by the hour, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Alexander found himself wondering if she might be right. If love alone was enough to justify destroying everything he'd spent his adult life building. His assistant knocked softly. "Sir?" Miss Martinez is here. She doesn't have an appointment, but—" "Send her in," Alexander said immediately. Courtney walked into his office wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup or jewelry to hide behind. She looked young and vulnerable and absolutely beautiful, and Alexander felt his heart break all over again. "You sent me money," she said without preamble, pulling the envelope from her purse and setting it on his desk. "I sent you options," Alexander corrected. "A way out that doesn't leave you with nothing." "And what about you? What way out do you get?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "I get to know that you're safe, that you're somewhere you can start over, build the life you deserve. Without you, without me." Courtney moved around his desk until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough to touch. "What if I don't want a life without you? Bella? No, listen to me." Her voice was steady, strong in a way he hadn't heard since this nightmare began. "For the past week, everyone has been making decisions about my life. Victoria, your board, the media, even you. Everyone except me. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection. I need you to fight for us." Courtney's eyes blazed with something Alexander hadn't seen before. Not just love, but courage. Raw, determined courage. "I need you to stop treating me like a problem to be solved and start treating me like the woman you want to spend your life with. The cost will be worth it," Courtney finished. "Alexander, I've been poor my entire adult life. I've lost jobs, lost apartments, lost everything I thought mattered. But I've never lost myself. Not until this week, when I almost let them convince me I wasn't worthy of fighting for." She reached up to frame his face with her hands, and Alexander leaned into her touch like a man dying of thirst. "You asked me once what made me happy," Courtney said softly. "It's you. Not your money, not your penthouse, not your ability to buy me beautiful things. Just you, exactly as you are when it's just us and the rest of the world disappears. Courtney, marry me," she said simply. Alexander went very still. "What? Marry me? Today, tomorrow, as soon as we can get a license. Not because it's practical or strategic or good for anyone's reputation, but because I love you and you love me, and that's the only thing that actually matters." Alexander stared at her, this extraordinary woman who'd turned his world upside down, and then offered to dive into the chaos with him. The smart move would be to say no, to send her away with the money and the plane ticket and the promise of a clean slate. Instead, Alexander Cross did the first truly reckless thing of his carefully controlled life. "Yes," he said, pulling her into his arms. "God, yes." They kissed there in his office with the resignation letters scattered across his desk and the city burning around them, choosing love over fear, each other over everything else. It would be messy and complicated, and probably cost them both more than they could imagine. But for the first time in a week, they were choosing together, and that made all the difference. The wedding ceremony had been a study in perfection, every detail orchestrated to demonstrate Charlotte's triumph, her ascension to the heights of society through strategic marriage. But as the guests moved from the chapel to the reception tent, the only thing anyone could talk about was the woman in champagne silk, who had transformed the entire narrative with her quiet dignity. Courtney Cross, she still felt a thrill when she thought her new name, stood beside her husband of 3 months, watching the elaborate reception unfold with the serene confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. The past few hours had been surreal, watching her family and their social circle scramble to recalibrate their understanding of who she was and what she represented. "Your sister keeps staring," Alexander murmured against her ear, his hand warm and possessive on her lower back. "I think she's having trouble processing the fact that her cautionary tale just became the evening's main attraction." Courtney followed his gaze to where Celia stood near the head table, still in her elaborate wedding gown, but looking somehow diminished beside her banking heir husband. Richard Blackwell III seemed nice enough, but there was something hollow about the way he looked at his new wife, like she was a beautiful acquisition rather than the love of his life. "I feel sorry for her," Courtney said quietly, and meant it. She planned this whole wedding to showcase her perfect life, And all anyone wants to talk about is how her failed sister married a billionaire. Do you regret coming? Courtney considered the question, thinking about the months since they'd made their choice to fight for each other instead of taking the easy way out. It hadn't been simple. Alexander's board had revolted, 2 major investors had pulled out, and the media attention had been brutal for weeks. But they'd weathered it together, and something extraordinary had emerged from the chaos. No, she said finally. I think I needed to see this. To understand that I don't need her approval anymore. I don't need anyone's approval except yours and my own. The transformation had been gradual but profound. After their impulsive decision to marry, a simple ceremony at City Hall with Frank and Maria as witnesses, Courtney had thrown herself into rebuilding Alexander's reputation not by hiding, but by becoming impossible to ignore. She'd started a foundation for women transitioning out of poverty, using her own story as the centerpiece. The media that had once painted her as a gold digger now covered her speeches at business schools, her mentorship programs, her partnership with organizations that provided job training and financial literacy. Most importantly, she'd insisted on transparency. Instead of letting Alexander's PR team craft a sanitized narrative, she'd told her truth. The whole truth. In a series of interviews that had redefined how people saw their relationship. Mrs. Cross. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Margaret Thornfield approached with the careful step of someone navigating treacherous social terrain. You look radiant. Thank you, Mother. The word felt strange after 3 years of estrangement, but Courtney had decided that life was too short for grudges that served no one. I owe you an apology, Margaret said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. I said terrible things when you left. Things that had more to do with my own fears than with who you actually are. Courtney studied her mother's face, seeing genuine regret beneath the carefully applied makeup. We all make mistakes when we're afraid. You've done well for yourself, Margaret continued, her eyes taking in the sapphire necklace, the designer dress, the quiet confidence that money couldn't buy. Though I suspect this success has more to do with your character than your circumstances. Money doesn't change who you are, Courtney said gently. It just gives you more resources to become who you were meant to be. Alexander squeezed her hand, a silent reminder that he was there, that they were facing this together. Margaret noticed the gesture, and something shifted in her expression. Mr. Cross, she said formally, I never properly welcomed you to the family. There's still time, Alexander replied with diplomatic grace. Courtney speaks of you often. With love, despite everything. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. I don't deserve her love, or her forgiveness. But you have both anyway, Courtney said. Because that's what family does. We forgive the unforgivable and love the unlovable, and we keep showing up even when it's hard. Across the tent, Sarah appeared with Richard in tow, her smile brittle as crystal. Courtney, darling, you simply must meet Richard properly. Richard, this is my sister Courtney and her husband Alexander. Richard extended his hand with the careful politeness of old money meeting new money. Mr. Cross, pleasure to meet you. I've followed your career. Quite impressive what you've accomplished. Thank you, Alexander replied smoothly. Though I have to say, my greatest accomplishment is convincing this extraordinary woman to marry me. The comment was perfectly pitched, gracious to Richard while making it clear that Courtney was Alexander's priority, not business networking. Charlotte's smile grew even more strained. How romantic, she said. Though I suppose when you have unlimited resources, grand gestures become rather easy. Actually, Courtney interjected softly, the most romantic thing Alexander ever did for me cost nothing at all. Oh, Charlotte's tone suggested polite interest masking genuine curiosity. He asked me what made me happy. Not what I needed or wanted, just what made me happy. No one had ever asked me that before. Courtney's eyes met Alexander's, and the love that passed between them was so tangible that even Sarah seemed to feel it. Everything else, the penthouse, the clothes, the jewelry, those are just beautiful bonuses. But being seen, being known, being loved for exactly who I am, that's priceless. Richard looked at his new wife with something approaching confusion, as if trying to remember if he'd ever asked Celia what made her happy. The expression on Charlotte's face suggested he hadn't. Well, Celia said brightly, different people value different things, I suppose. Some of us prefer security to sentiment. And some of us are lucky enough to find both, Courtney replied without a trace of malice. The conversation was interrupted by the band launching into their first dance song. Richard dutifully led Celia to the dance floor, where they moved through a perfectly choreographed routine that had clearly been rehearsed to within an inch of its life. Shall we? Alexander offered Courtney his arm. On the dance floor, surrounded by couples performing the elaborate social ritual of a society wedding, Courtney and Alexander moved together with the natural grace of two people who'd learned to navigate life as a team. Other dancers gradually formed a circle around them, drawn by something indefinable. The way Alexander looked at Courtney, like she was the only person in the room, the way she smiled at him with complete trust and joy. Any regrets? Alexander asked as he spun her gently. Only that it took us so long to find each other, Courtney replied. What about you? I regret every day I lived before I met you, Alexander said simply. Everything else was just preparation for this. As the song ended, the crowd applauded, not just for the dancing, but for something deeper. The kind of love that made everyone who witnessed it believe in possibilities they'd forgotten existed. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began filtering toward their cars and drivers, Celia approached Courtney one final time. The bride looked exhausted, her perfect makeup finally showing signs of wear, her elaborate gown wilted despite the climate-controlled tent. You won, Celia said quietly. This wasn't a competition, Courtney replied. Wasn't it? Growing up, everything was a competition between us. Grades, clothes, attention, opportunities. And I always won because I was willing to do whatever it took. Courtney studied her sister's face, seeing past the makeup and designer gown to the scared girl underneath. What did you win, Victoria? Security. Status. A husband who'll never leave me for someone younger or prettier, because our prenup makes it too expensive. And what did I win? Celia was quiet for a long moment, watching Alexander across the tent as he chatted with Frank. Yes, Frank, whom they'd flown in especially for the wedding because he'd become like family to them both. Everything I was too afraid to reach for, Celia said finally. Love that sees past your flaws. Someone who chooses you not for what you can give them, but for who you are when you think no one's watching. It's not too late, Courtney said gently. For you to have that too. Yes, it is. Charlotte's smile was sad but not bitter. I made my choice. And despite everything, despite the way I treated you, you made yours. You chose to believe you deserved more than crumbs, and you were right. She paused, adjusting her wedding ring with hands that trembled slightly. I'm happy for you, Courtney. Truly. Even if I'm terrible at showing it. I love you too, Courtney said, and pulled her sister into a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and regret and the faintest hint of hope. As Alexander and Courtney prepared to leave, their driver waiting with a car that would take them to the private jet for their delayed honeymoon in Italy, Courtney looked back at the wedding tent one final time. Her family was there, flawed, complicated, but trying to find their way back to each other. Her past was there too, all the years of struggle and disappointment that had shaped her into someone strong enough to recognize real love when it found her. But her future was beside her, holding her hand and looking at her like she hung the stars in the sky. Ready, Mrs. Cross? Alexander asked. Ready, Mr. Cross, Courtney replied. And as their car pulled away from the estate where she'd once been told she didn't belong, Courtney reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. From the scared girl serving coffee at Murphy's diner to the confident woman who'd just transformed her sister's perfect wedding into a celebration of authentic love. The fairy tale was real, not because a billionaire had rescued her from poverty, but because two broken people had chosen to heal together. Because love, real love, didn't just change your circumstances, it changed your understanding of what you deserved from life. 6 months ago, Courtney Martinez had been invisible, forgotten, convinced she was worth nothing more than scraps and leftovers. Tonight, Courtney Cross was flying to Italy with the love of her life, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. And sometimes, that kind of transformation was the most magical thing of all. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love and healing. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to Liam's Stories, and share it with someone who believes in the power of love. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and about a time when love helped you heal. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories of transformation and triumph. Until next time, keep believing in love's power to heal even the most broken hearts. Thank you for being part of our Liam's family.